The snow was falling hard that night, sharp, wind-whipped flurries slicing through the silence like 1,000 tiny knives. Most people in town were curled up indoors, behind locked doors and thick curtains, safe from the storm that swallowed the streets whole. But out behind an abandoned bus stop on the corner of Elm and Ridgeway, a young woman knelt in the freezing dark, her trembling hands clutching a thin, faded blanket. It was the only one she had. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. Her fingers were raw. Her boots had holes. And yet, as her frostbitten eyes landed on the stranger lying half buried in the snow, barely breathing, unmoving, she made a choice that most would not. She took her only blanket and covered him first. Warning: if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of humanity even in its most broken moments, please take a second to like, comment, share, and subscribe to this channel, Kindness Tales. Every click helps spread more stories like this to people who may need them most. Warning. Her name was Alina. Just 24, but life had aged her in ways the calendar never could. She had once dreamed of being a nurse, someone who saved lives. But fate hadn't been kind. Her mother died when she was 16, and with no father in the picture, Alina bounced from one foster home to another until she finally aged out of the system. No one ever really gave her a chance. She got a few jobs here and there, waiting tables, cleaning houses, but when the pandemic hit, everything dried up. Before long, she was living in her car. And when the engine died that December, she had no choice but to walk away from the only shelter she had left. Still, Alina was not bitter. She carried a softness in her that even the world's cruelty hadn't hardened. She didn't have much, but she had hope, and more importantly, she had compassion. That night, the storm had arrived earlier than expected. She had planned to sleep in the empty bus shelter with her blanket wrapped tight, huddled in the corner where the wind didn't cut as deep. But just as she arrived, she saw him, an older man, maybe in his 60s, slumped against the concrete wall, barely conscious. His lips were blue. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. His clothes were soaked and thin. Alina knew the signs. Hypothermia. Without warmth, he wouldn't survive the night. She hesitated only a second before dropping to her knees beside him. Her own teeth chattered as she unfolded her blanket, thin but dry, and gently laid it over his body. She pulled it around his shoulders, tucking it in tightly, pressing her own arms around him to transfer whatever body heat she could offer. The cold immediately clawed at her exposed back, but she stayed close to him, whispering soft reassurances into the icy wind as if her words could keep his soul from slipping away. She didn't know his name, where he came from, or what had led him to that street corner. But in that moment, none of it mattered. He was a human being, and he was dying, and she had something, however small, that might help. So she gave it. Hours passed slowly. The wind howled like a wounded animal. Alina's fingers went numb. Her knees ached from the cold concrete. But still, she didn't move. At one point, she thought she might fall asleep, but every time she felt her eyes grow heavy, she shook herself awake. She needed to stay alert, for him. When the first rays of morning light began to pierce the heavy gray clouds, Alina barely noticed. Her thoughts were drifting, and her body felt distant. But then, she felt it, a small movement. The man stirred under the blanket. He coughed. Then he opened his eyes, just barely, and looked at her. "You saved me," he whispered hoarsely. Alina forced a weak smile. "I tried." Moments later, a passing garbage truck spotted them. The driver, alarmed, called an ambulance. Paramedics arrived swiftly, wrapping them both in thermal blankets and rushing them to the nearest hospital. The man was stabilized. Alina was treated for early-stage frostbite and dehydration. The doctor said if she had stayed out another hour, she might have lost her fingers, or worse. That could have been the end of the story. A moment of quiet heroism, a forgotten girl saving a forgotten man. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The man's name was Thomas Granger. And while he looked like just another down-and-out stranger on the street, he hadn't always been that way. Just 5 years prior, he was the CEO of a mid-sized logistics company. He had money, a house, a family. But when his wife passed away from cancer, everything unraveled. Grief swallowed him. He lost interest in the business. His adult children, angry at his detachment, distanced themselves. Eventually, Thomas lost the company, then the house, and finally, his will to keep going. He had been on the streets for almost 2 years when Alina found him. But now, lying in a hospital bed, wrapped in warmth and flooded with memories, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the young woman who gave him her only blanket. He asked about her every day. He learned her name, her story, and the quiet grace with which she lived, even in poverty. When he was discharged, Thomas didn't return to the streets. He found a small motel to stay in, using the last of his emergency funds. And then, he started making calls, lots of them. He reached out to old contacts, former employees, even his estranged son. He told them everything, about the night he almost died, and the woman who saved him. Something inside him had shifted. He was no longer a man broken by grief. He had seen what true strength looked like. 3 weeks later, Alina was discharged too. She expected to return to the bus shelter, maybe try the local mission for food. But when she stepped outside, she saw Thomas waiting there, with a coat in his hands, and tears in his eyes. "I don't have much," he said, "but I have enough to get us started. You saved my life. Let me help you rebuild yours." At first, she resisted. She didn't want charity. But Thomas wasn't offering pity, he was offering partnership. And together, slowly, they began to climb out of the hole life had buried them in. Thomas used his network to help Alina get into a nursing program with financial aid. He himself began consulting part-time for a former colleague's shipping company. They rented a modest apartment together, each with their own room, their own space, but bonded by something deeper than blood, shared survival, and a kind of love that went beyond romance. A love rooted in humanity, respect, and second chances. Word of their story eventually spread. A local journalist caught wind of it and ran a feature. Then a regional news station picked it up. Offers came in, from nonprofits, schools, even strangers inspired by what they had read. But Alina never let it go to her head. She still volunteered at shelters. Still handed out socks and granola bars to people living where she once did. She remembered what it felt like to have nothing but a single blanket, and still choose to share it. Years later, Alina finally became a registered nurse. At her graduation, Thomas sat in the front row, clapping so hard he nearly cried. He wore a tie she had given him, found at a thrift store for $2, and she wore a small pin he had made, a silver heart with a tiny snowflake inside it. They never forgot that night. Not the cold. Not the fear. But most of all, not the choice that changed everything, one thin blanket, 2 lives saved. Red heart, if this story touched your heart, please don't scroll away. Leave a like, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Kindness Tales. You never know who might need to hear this today. Red heart. Speech balloon, tell us in the comments, what would you do if you had only one blanket and saw a stranger freezing in the dark? We want to hear your thoughts. Your words might inspire someone else. Because sometimes, the smallest act of compassion is the first step toward a miracle.